This story is titled, My Ex-Wife and Her New Man Broke Into My House. Now they're in jail. Looking back, I suppose the warning signs were always there, lingering in the small, quiet moments I brushed aside. Love has a way of making you see what you want to see, convincing you that flaws are nothing more than quirks, and that red flags are simply misunderstandings waiting to be resolved. When I met Laura, I was 30, working long hours as a mechanic, pouring my energy into building a stable life. I had a modest home, decent savings, and a simple dream, to find someone to share it all with. And for a while, I truly believed Laura was that person. She was a force of nature, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and command attention without saying a word. She had a way of making people feel like they were the only ones in the world when she spoke to them, flashing that easy, practiced smile that made it impossible not to be drawn in. I was no exception. From the moment we met, I was captivated. She was warm, affectionate, and full of life. And in those early days, I felt like the luckiest man alive. The first year of our relationship was a blur of excitement. Weekend getaways, candlelit dinners, spontaneous road trips that made me feel like I was living inside one of those romantic movies she loved so much. She was always the center of attention, the one everyone gravitated toward at parties, and I took pride in that. It felt good to be the man beside the woman everyone admired. But what I didn't realize at the time was that admiration wasn't enough for Laura. She needed more than love, more than stability. She needed extravagance, constant excitement, and a life that sparkled like the designer jewelry she always dreamed of owning. At first, I indulged her whims without much thought. A new handbag here, a last-minute vacation there. It seemed harmless, even endearing. I convinced myself that she simply had high standards, that she deserved nice things, and that it was my job to provide them. But over time, it became clear that it wasn't about occasional luxuries. It was about expectations. Laura didn't just want these things, she felt entitled to them. And as the months stretched into years, it became apparent that my love, my effort, and my long hours at the shop weren't enough to satisfy her. She wanted more, always more. If I suggested saving money for the future, she'd scoff, reminding me that life was meant to be lived, not hoarded away for some distant tomorrow. If I hesitated before making a purchase, she'd roll her eyes, dismissing me as cheap, as if my caution was a personal failure rather than simple financial responsibility. Her spending became a point of tension, but even that wasn't the real issue. The real problem was the way she began to look at me. Not as her partner, but as an obstacle standing between her and the life she believed she deserved. Love, in her eyes, wasn't about partnership or mutual support. It was about being taken care of, being provided for. And as time passed, her patience with my so-called small-time lifestyle wore thinner and thinner. The shift in our relationship was subtle at first. She would make offhand comments about the husbands of her friends, men with bigger houses, flashier cars, careers that allowed their wives to spend their afternoons at yoga studios instead of budgeting for groceries. I told myself she was just venting, that everyone compared their lives to others now and then. But deep down, I knew better. The day everything fell apart started like any other. It was a random Tuesday, nothing special, nothing unusual. I had finished a big job early, wrapping up at the shop ahead of schedule, and decided to surprise Laura by coming home early. I had this foolish idea in my head that maybe we could have a quiet evening together, maybe sit on the couch and watch one of those ridiculous reality shows she loved so much. Just a small moment, a chance to reconnect. But when I walked through the front door, I knew something was off. The sound of laughter drifted from the living room, light and playful, the kind of laugh I hadn't heard from her in a long time. At first, I assumed she was on the phone, chatting with a friend, but then I heard something that made my stomach twist into a cold, heavy knot. Don't worry, babe, he'll never find out. For a moment, I stood frozen in the entryway, my mind scrambling to process what I had just heard. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, a dull roar that drowned out the rest of the conversation. I took a slow step forward, careful not to make a sound. And then, as if sensing my presence, Laura turned. For the briefest second, her expression flickered. Shock, guilt, something unreadable. But it vanished just as quickly, replaced by a carefully crafted smile. She tilted her head, her voice light, casual, as if I had simply caught her watching TV. "Oh, hey, you're home early." I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. My eyes drifted to the phone still clutched in her hand. The call abruptly ended. The air between us felt thick, suffocating. I forced my voice to remain even, controlled. "Who was that?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to know she was about to lie. "Just a coworker," she said too quickly, slipping the phone into her pocket like it was nothing. I nodded, but I didn't believe her. Not for a second. That night, after she had gone to bed, I sat in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind running in circles. There was no denying what I had heard, no brushing it aside or convincing myself that I had misunderstood. And so, against every instinct I had, I reached for her phone. I won't pretend that I didn't feel guilty as I scrolled through her messages, but that guilt evaporated the moment I saw his name. Dan. I didn't know much about him beyond the fact that he worked with her, but in the span of a few minutes, I learned more than I ever wanted to. Their messages stretched back months, flirty conversations, inside jokes, detailed plans for stolen moments together. And worst of all, there were messages about me. He's so clueless. Honestly, I don't know how he hasn't figured it out yet. You deserve someone who can actually take care of you. Adam's too small time for you. I sat there for a long time, phone in hand, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. And in that moment, something inside me hardened. The next morning, I didn't say a word. I didn't confront her, didn't give her the satisfaction of a fight. Instead, I walked out the door and went straight to my lawyer's office. By the time I handed Laura the divorce papers, she was blindsided. Maybe she thought I'd sit around and let her explain, that I'd beg her to stay or try to win her back. But she underestimated me. For the first time in a long time, I was done playing the fool. Looking back, I don't think Laura ever truly believed I would leave. She had spent years molding our relationship into something she controlled, twisting every argument, every moment of doubt, into something that was somehow my fault. She had learned how to manipulate me in subtle ways, convincing me that my concerns were overreactions, that my exhaustion was just part of being a good husband, that my financial worries were simply a reflection of my inability to provide at the level she expected. And for too long, I had played along, letting myself believe that if I just worked a little harder, made a little more, gave a little extra, she would finally be satisfied. But when I handed her those divorce papers, the illusion shattered. I will never forget the way her expression shifted as she read through them, her fingers tightening around the stack of neatly prepared documents, as if she could physically crush the reality of what they represented. At first, she laughed, this short, breathy sound that was more disbelief than amusement, because in her mind, I wasn't the one who got to walk away. That was a role reserved for her. She was supposed to be the one leaving me behind for something better, for someone better. She was supposed to win, and yet there I was, standing in front of her, completely calm, completely done, and she couldn't comprehend it. When the laughter faded, the rage took over. It came swiftly, like a storm breaking across her face, twisting her features into something ugly and unfamiliar. She demanded to know if I was serious, if I had really gone behind her back and done this without even giving her a chance to explain, as if there was anything left to say. As if I hadn't already heard everything I needed to hear in those messages with Dan, those little exchanges where they had mocked me, belittled me, treated me like some clueless fool who existed solely to fund her lifestyle while she played the role of a devoted wife. I let her rant. I let her call me names, let her accuse me of being cruel, of being heartless, of overreacting to something that, in her mind, wasn't even that serious. But I didn't engage. I didn't fight back. I didn't give her the emotional reaction she was searching for, the outburst she could latch onto and use to justify everything she had done. Instead, I simply stood there, unmoving, as she realized that for the first time in our entire marriage, she had lost control. And that was when the panic set in. The threats came next, thinly veiled at first, hints that she would ruin me, take everything, make sure I walked away with nothing. She told me she'd get the best lawyer money could buy, that she'd drag this out for years if she had to, that I was naive if I thought I could just walk away from her without consequences. And maybe, months earlier, I would have been afraid. I would have second-guessed myself, would have hesitated, would have wondered if it was really worth the battle. But standing there, watching her scramble for control, I felt nothing but relief. Because the truth was, Laura had already drained me of everything long before that moment. The money, the house, the material things. None of it mattered anymore. I had already lost something far more valuable over the years. The version of myself who had once believed in love, in trust, in the idea that marriage was built on partnership rather than power. And now I was just reclaiming what little I had left. I walked out of the house that night without looking back. I didn't pack a bag, didn't take anything but my car keys and the certainty that I was finally free. And yet, even as I drove away, leaving behind the life we had built, I knew Laura wasn't done with me. The divorce itself was a war. She fought me on everything, dragging out the process with every legal trick she could think of, determined to make me pay for daring to leave her. She demanded half of everything, tried to claim assets she had never even contributed to, pushed for alimony despite never lifting a finger to financially support our marriage. And Dan, pathetic, spineless Dan, stood by her side through it all, playing the role of the dutiful boyfriend, as if he had somehow won some kind of prize rather than inheriting the wreckage of the life I was walking away from. At one point, she even tried to manipulate me into staying, switching tactics from rage to remorse, sending long, teary messages about how she had made a mistake, about how we could fix things, about how she still loved me. And maybe once upon a time I would have believed her. But love, I had come to learn, was not just words. Love was actions. And Laura's actions had made it clear exactly where I stood in her world. So I didn't respond. I let the lawyers handle it. And when it was finally over, when the judge signed the papers and I was legally, officially, mercifully free, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. But if I thought that was the end of Laura's influence in my life, I was sorely mistaken. Because some people don't let go easily. Some people refuse to accept that they have lost.
And Laura?
Laura wasn't done with me yet. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. There was a weight that had settled so deeply into my chest during my marriage that I hadn't even realized how heavy it was until it was gone. In the days following the finalization of the divorce, I found myself waking up without the tight knot of stress in my stomach, without the endless cycle of second guessing, without the gnawing feeling that I wasn't enough, that I would never be enough. The silence of my house, once suffocating, had become something close to peaceful. The absence of Laura's constant demands, her pointed sighs, her carefully constructed guilt trips. It was like removing a stone from my shoe after walking on it for miles. The pain had become so normal that I had forgotten what it felt like to exist without it. I spent the first few weeks simply relearning what it meant to live on my own terms. I worked when I wanted to work. I ate what I wanted to eat. I slept without the sound of her restless tossing beside me, without the knowledge that at any given moment she might wake up with yet another complaint, another demand, another reason to remind me that I wasn't meeting some unspoken expectation. I began fixing up the house, not because she wanted something new or trendy, but because I wanted it to feel like mine again. I repainted the walls, replaced the furniture she had insisted on buying, filled the space with things that made me feel at home rather than things that fit into her carefully curated aesthetic. Little by little, I carved out a version of my life that belonged solely to me. But just when I thought I had finally put her behind me, the past had a way of creeping back in. At first, it was subtle. A missed call from an unknown number that, when I checked the voicemail, was just an empty stretch of silence before the line disconnected. A text message from a number I didn't recognize. I just want to talk. A friend mentioning, in passing, that they had seen Laura around town. That she had asked about me in a way that felt too casual, too rehearsed. Like she was waiting for an opportunity to slip back into my life. I ignored it. I told myself it was nothing, that she would move on, that she had already moved on. After all, she had Dan now, didn't she? She had gotten everything she wanted, the money, the new relationship, the so-called upgrade from the life she had claimed was too small for her. What reason would she have to look back? But then, little things started going missing. At first, I assumed I had just misplaced them. A set of spare keys that had been in my kitchen drawer for years. A couple of old photo albums that I could have sworn were packed away in the closet. I didn't think much of it until I noticed that my mailbox had been tampered with, small rips along the edges, where it had been pried open just enough for someone to slip their hand inside. And then came the package, a small, unmarked envelope left on my doorstep, with nothing inside but a single photograph. It was a picture of Laura and me on our wedding day. That was when I knew she wasn't done with me. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she had just found some old photos and thought I might want them. Maybe this was her way of finding closure, of making peace with the way things had ended. But deep down, I knew better. Laura was not the kind of woman who left things unresolved. She was not the kind of woman who let things go. The next time my phone buzzed with an unknown number, I hesitated before answering. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for me to think it might be another one of those dead-air voicemails. But then, just as I was about to hang up, a voice broke through the static. It was Laura. She didn't sound angry, didn't sound bitter or desperate. If anything, she sounded amused. As if all of this, the break-ins, the missing items, the photograph, was nothing more than a game to her. She told me she had been thinking about me lately, that she had started to wonder if maybe we had made a mistake. She told me that Dan wasn't everything she had expected him to be, that he didn't get her the way I did, that no matter how much money he spent on her, there was something missing, something she had only ever felt when she was with me. She laughed when I didn't respond right away, as if she had expected my silence, as if she had anticipated my hesitation. And then, with the kind of confidence that had once made me fall in love with her, She said something that made my blood run cold. You know, Adam, you never really did change the locks. I hung up immediately. I barely remembered grabbing my jacket, barely felt the cold air on my skin as I stepped outside and drove straight to the hardware store. I bought new locks for every door, every window, every possible entry point she could have access to. I installed security cameras, changed my phone number, notified my bank that she was no longer authorized on any of my accounts. I did everything I could to erase whatever foothold she still had in my life. But even as I did, I knew it wasn't over. Laura was like a storm that refused to pass, lingering at the edges of my world, waiting for the right moment to crash back in. And though I had spent years believing that I could handle her, that I could weather whatever chaos she brought into my life, I was beginning to understand that some people didn't just let go. Some people made sure you remembered them. There's something unsettling about knowing someone has been in your home, about realizing that the space you considered your own, a place of solitude, of safety, of retreat, has been violated by a presence that does not belong. It's not just about the missing items or the subtle disturbances in the way things are arranged. It's the feeling of intrusion that lingers, the awareness that at some point, in some moment when you weren't looking, someone stepped into your world uninvited, leaving behind nothing but the faintest traces of their trespass. And even though I had done everything in my power to shut Laura out, changing the locks, installing security cameras, cutting off every last connection she could use to reach me, there was a part of me that knew, deep down, that she wasn't finished. That knowledge sat with me like an itch beneath the skin, something I couldn't quite shake no matter how many precautions I took. And so, when the sound of glass shattering jolted me awake in the dead of night, when the distant thud of footsteps echoed through the quiet of my house, I wasn't entirely surprised. I had been waiting for this. The adrenaline hit me fast, flooding my veins, sharpening my senses in an instant. My mind, sluggish from sleep just moments before, became painfully alert as I pushed myself out of bed, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The house, bathed in darkness, felt suddenly unfamiliar, the walls too close, the silence too heavy. I reached for my phone, my fingers unsteady as I pulled up the security feed, my breath catching as the screen flickered to life. There they were, Laura and Dan. They were standing in the living room, just beyond the broken window, their silhouettes distorted in the grainy glow of the night vision camera. Laura, as always, looked effortlessly composed, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable, as if this were nothing more than a casual visit, rather than a criminal act. Dan, on the other hand, was a mess of nervous energy, his movements jerky, his head snapping toward every small sound, every flicker of light, as if at any moment he expected the world to collapse around him. For a brief moment, I simply watched them, a strange detachment settling over me as I observed the way they moved through my home with an ease that made my stomach turn. It was as if they belonged there, as if they had every right to be in a space I had worked so hard to reclaim. Laura's fingers trailed along the edge of the coffee table, her gaze flickering toward the photographs on the wall, the remnants of a life she had once shared with me, before she turned to Dan with a smirk that sent a chill down my spine. They were looking for something. I didn't hesitate. My hands were already dialing 911 before I even realized I had made the decision, my voice low and steady as I relayed the situation to the dispatcher, my words precise, measured, calculated. There was no panic in my tone, no desperation, just the cold certainty that I was finally watching the inevitable unfold. Because this was inevitable. Laura had never been the type to walk away quietly. She had always needed the last word, always needed to be the one in control. And now, as I watched her instruct Dan to try the door to my office, as I saw the way her expression remained eerily calm, even as the distant sound of sirens began to pierce the quiet night, I knew she had convinced herself that she could still win. But this time, she wouldn't. The moment the flashing red and blue lights flooded through the windows, Dan panicked. He turned to run, his instincts kicking in. But Laura didn't move. She stood there, perfectly still, her gaze locked onto the front door as the officers stormed inside, her face betraying nothing, not fear, not regret, not even anger. And as they shoved Dan against the wall, as they secured Laura's hands behind her back, as she finally turned to look at me, standing in the doorway of my bedroom, watching the scene unfold with a numb sense of finality, I realized that, for the first time since the moment I had met her, I held all the power, and she hated it. Even as they led her away, even as Dan sobbed and pleaded and tried to explain himself, even as the officers rattled off charges of breaking and entering, trespassing, property damage, Laura didn't say a word. She didn't fight, didn't struggle, didn't even flinch. She simply lifted her chin, her gaze steady, unwavering, her lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile as if to say, "This isn't over." But for me, it was because as I stood there, watching the taillights of the patrol car disappear into the darkness, the weight of her presence finally lifting from my home, from my life, from my very skin, I knew that whatever twisted version of love she had once claimed to feel for me had long since rotted into something unrecognizable. And I knew, without a doubt, that I was never going to let her drag me back into the wreckage she had created. This time, I was truly free. First update. The silence after they were gone was almost deafening, like the weight of the past few years had finally lifted, leaving behind a hollow space where all the tension and uncertainty had once lived. For the first time in what felt like forever, I stood in the middle of my home, my actual home, not just a place I existed in under the shadow of someone else's control, and I breathed. It was a slow, deliberate inhale, as if my body had forgotten what it was like to exist without waiting for the next fight, the next demand, the next betrayal. But even as I tried to settle into that moment, to let the relief of Laura's arrest fully sink in, a quiet voice at the back of my mind whispered that it wasn't over. Because with someone like her, it never really was. The officers had taken their statements, walked me through the process of pressing charges, assured me that this was a serious offense, and that Laura and Dan would be facing real consequences for their little stunt. But I knew how Laura operated. I knew that she had spent her entire life dodging accountability, weaving her way through situations that should have ruined her, but never quite did. And I knew that, no matter how much I wanted to believe that this was the last time I would ever have to deal with her, she wasn't the kind of person who accepted defeat. Still, I wasn't going to let that stop me from finally moving forward. The very next morning, I replaced the shattered window, reinforcing it with a security system that made my house feel more like a fortress than a home. I changed every lock again, installed cameras in every corner, made sure that if she ever tried to pull something like this again, she wouldn't get past the driveway before the police were on their way. It wasn't just about protecting my property. It was about reclaiming my peace of mind, about making sure that no matter how hard she tried, she would never again have access to my space, my life, my sanity. And for a while it worked. The days turned into weeks, and I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this really was the end of it. Laura was out of my hands now, tangled up in the legal system, and for the first time in years, I had no obligation to clean up after her mess. I threw myself into my work, into rebuilding the friendships I had neglected, into rediscovering what it meant to be someone who wasn't constantly looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next disaster to strike. But then the letters started coming. At first, I ignored them. They were postmarked from a county jail, thick envelopes filled with pages of what I could only assume were Laura's desperate attempts to worm her way back into my life. I never opened a single one. I never even let my eyes linger on my own name written in her familiar cursive on the front of the envelopes. I would pick them up from the mailbox, feel the weight of them in my hands, and then drop them directly into the trash. It was only when I received a call from her lawyer that I realized she was escalating. The man on the other end of the line was professional, almost overly polite, his tone laced with that calculated smoothness that lawyers are trained to use when they're trying to convince you of something you have no reason to entertain. He informed me that Laura was deeply remorseful, that she had made a terrible mistake in a moment of emotional distress, that she was hoping, pleading actually, for me to reconsider pressing charges. I didn't bother responding. I hung up before he could finish his pitch, blocking the number without a second thought. And for a while, I thought that would be enough. But then, Laura played her final card. Dan took a plea deal. Apparently, he had no interest in going down for breaking and entering, especially when it had been Laura's idea from the start. He sang like a canary, painting the full picture of what had happened that night, including the fact that Laura had planned it weeks in advance. The prosecution had more than enough to secure a conviction, and even though it wouldn't land her in prison for years, it was enough to put her behind bars long enough for her world to crumble. And that's when she did something I should have expected. She reached out to me one last time, but this time she didn't beg. She threatened. The final letter that came through my mailbox wasn't like the others. It wasn't pleading for forgiveness or swearing that she had changed. No. This time her words were sharp, pointed, dripping with that same cold calculation that had once made her so dangerously convincing. She told me that when she got out, she wouldn't forget this. She told me that I had ruined her life and that she would find a way to return the favor. And in that moment, as I stood there holding the weight of her final warning in my hands, I didn't feel fear. I felt relief. Because for the first time, Laura had finally dropped the act. There was no more pretending, no more manipulation, no more carefully crafted lies designed to lure me back into her orbit. She'd shown me exactly who she was, in the rawest, most unfiltered way possible. And I had won, because I would never, ever let her back into my life. Second update, there's a strange kind of silence that comes after a storm, a quiet so profound that it almost feels unnatural, like the world itself is holding its breath. Unsure of whether the chaos has truly passed or if it's simply regrouping, gathering its strength for one final strike. In the weeks that followed Laura's last letter, that was the silence I lived in. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like a lingering awareness, a tension in the back of my mind, a sense that even though she was physically locked away, her presence still clung to the edges of my life like a shadow that refused to fully disappear. But as the days stretched into weeks and the weeks blurred into months, that tension began to loosen its grip. Life, slowly but surely, started to feel like mine again. There were no more unexpected phone calls from unknown numbers, no more unsettling letters waiting in my mailbox, no more eerie late-night disturbances that made my skin crawl. Laura had been removed from my reality, her influence severed in a way that felt permanent for the first time since the day I met her. And without her, I began to rediscover the parts of myself that I had lost along the way. At first, it was small things, waking up without immediately bracing for a fight, going about my day without the constant weight of someone else's expectations pressing down on me, feeling a genuine sense of peace in my own home instead of a temporary reprieve between battles. But then, as time passed, I found myself reaching for more. I started making plans again, setting goals that had nothing to do with putting out fires or keeping someone else happy. I reconnected with old friends, repaired relationships that had suffered under the strain of my marriage, allowed myself to truly enjoy the simple things I had once taken for granted. And perhaps the biggest shift of all was that, for the first time in years, I no longer felt the need to look over my shoulder. The legal proceedings had played out exactly as expected. Dan's plea deal had ensured that he would get off with probation, community service, and a permanent stain on his record, a consequence he had been more than willing to accept if it meant avoiding jail time. Laura, on the other hand, had not been so lucky. While her sentence wasn't long enough to be life-altering, it was enough. Enough to remind her that she wasn't untouchable. Enough to show her that her actions had real consequences. Enough to strip her of the control she had once wielded so effortlessly. And that was all I needed. She would be out eventually, of course. The system would see to that. But by then, I would be so far removed from her world that it wouldn't matter. Because I had moved on. Not just from Laura. From the person I had been when I was with her. From the version of myself who had spent years settling, enduring, convincing himself that love meant sacrifice even when the scales were so unbalanced that he had nothing left to give. That man no longer existed. Instead, I had become someone new. Someone who had learned the hard way that walking away isn't weakness. It's survival. That choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. That true freedom doesn't come from avoiding conflict, but from finally facing it head-on and refusing to let it define you. And as I stood in the doorway of my home one evening, watching the sun sink behind the horizon, feeling the quiet hum of a life that finally felt like my own, I knew that I had done just that. Laura was a chapter I had closed, a storm I had weathered, a ghost that no longer haunted the spaces I lived in. And no matter what the future held, no matter where life took me from here, I would never let anyone take that away from me again.